Now, there are two different types of hypothesis tests, and I included in your cheat sheet for test 3, I included a flow chart for each type. So there's two types of hypothesis tests given in this chapter, or these two chapters. Really, chapter 22 was more about the type 1 and type 2 errors that could be committed when doing a hypothesis test, and when you can determine the probability that you may have committed one of those errors. So since we're skipping that particular part and we're just getting to the conclusion, and we're not going to talk about the probability of a type 1 error or whether you had a type 2 error, we're really only going to focus on the hypothesis test from chapter 23 itself and not the part about the possible errors. So really it's just the two types of hypothesis tests mentioned in chapter 23, and the first type, which is like problem 9 from the practice test, will be on test 3, and it's also on the practice test for test 3, is to test a claim about a population percentage. And so there's a flow chart, and the flow chart for this type of problem is in the cheat sheet. And so if there's a claim about a population percentage, you'll know that you need to go to this particular flow chart. So if you go to the second section of your cheat sheet, which starts on page 8 of the cheat sheet, the very first flow chart you come to is a flow chart that's on page 545, 546. The page numbers are at the top of your cheat sheet here. These were taken out of another book. So it's really page 545 and 546 of another textbook, and I photocopied those pages. And it gives you the instructions step by step, the 6 steps, and we're going to follow what's called the p-value method. There's actually, when you get to step 4 in this flow chart, and when you get to step 4 of the other type of flow chart, that's where it branches in the given flow chart from the classical method and the p-value method. You need to make sure that when you get to steps 4, 5, and 6, that you branch off and follow the instructions that are listed under p-value approach. That'll be on the right. We're not following the steps for the classical approach. It's simpler to follow the p-value method, and that's the method I've given you notes about. So when you're using this flow chart, make sure when you get to step 4 that you follow the p-value approach, not the classical approach. And the second type, make sure this is all coming into the second type, which is going to be like problem 10 on test 3, is when you're going to test a claim about a population mean. So when you test a claim about a population mean, then we're going to follow the flow chart on pages 520 and 521. There's a similar, very similar 6-step flow chart for these types of hypothesis tests, also in your cheat sheet. So if you go to your cheat sheet and you continue to flip pages, after you get past pages 545 and 546, which is for testing claims about population percentages, then you get pages 520 and 521. That come out of another book, and that gives a 6-step flow chart for testing claims about population means. The 6-step flow chart on page 545 and 546 looks very similar, and is very similar to the flow chart given on pages 520 and 521. There is only a slight difference, and the difference is going to come in step 3. In step 3, we're going to calculate, and the formula for it is in the flow chart. You're going to calculate a test statistic to get a p-value. And the formula for the test statistic in the flow chart on page 545 and 546 is different than the formula for the test statistic that's given in step 3 on page 520 and 521. The reason why is the information that you're getting statistically is different when you're dealing with population percentages than population means. This is categorical data. The first type of hypothesis test deals with categorical data, so you're not going to have any statistical information about things like the mean or standard deviation. So the test statistic is only going to be based on the sample proportion, a proportion that comes from step 1, which we call P0, and the sample size, whereas the sample statistic in step 3 for the second type of flowchart on page 520 and 521, it's going to involve sample statistics for measurement level data. So those sample statistics are going to include things like the size of the sample mean, and the samples and the population standard deviation. So the test statistic in this second flow chart will be different, and it will involve numbers that are you would get from a sample when you're analyzing measurement level data, like standard deviations and means. But other than the difference in step 3 between one flow chart and the next, all the other steps are more or less the same. And the way you do the very, very last step, step 6, is of course going to be the same. So where you use that flow chart at the very end of the cheat sheet to get your final conclusion. All that's going to be the same. The only real difference between these two flow charts is going to be the formula you use to get your test statistic. Once you get your test statistic, how you get your p-value from the test statistic is going to be exactly the same for this type of flow chart as that flow chart. So both types of hypothesis test problems are exactly the same in how you get your p-value from the test statistic, how you analyze the p-value and the significance level to get an answer to step 5, and how to use the flow chart for the very last step. All that's going to be exactly the same for both of these. The first two steps are also going to be the same. Their only difference is in step 3. And the formula that you're going to need in step 3 of either flow chart is already in the flow chart that's given in the cheat sheet. So all you have to do is, when you get to step 3 of the flow chart, is just plug the given information into the given formula for step 3 to get that test statistic. And that formula will look different for this one than this one. But other than that, they're almost identical in the way that you do them. Now, our book doesn't go through and give you the detailed step-by-step flow charts as much as sort of a slightly vague, and it doesn't provide any tables that are needed. That's why I supplemented this with the extra handouts to make it as easy and repeatable as I can make it for you. And included also in the cheat sheet is when you get to step 4, where you get your test statistic from step 3, and you have to get what's called the p-value of the test in step 4 using your test statistic from step 3. Both flowcharts do it in the same way. And that test statistic is going to be treated like a z-score, what we call the standard score back in chapter 8. And you need a little bit more comprehensive version of that table from chapter 8. That table that was on page 157 for bell-shaped distributions that enabled you to convert standard scores for data values into percentiles. Well, we have a more detailed version of that table in your cheat sheet. After you get past the last flow chart in the cheat sheet, the very next two pages of the cheat sheet are table 5. And table 5 is a table that enables you to convert z-scores into table values that somehow represent percentiles. You have one page for negative z-scores, and you have another page for positive z-scores. These are the two tables we're going to use in step 4 of each flowchart in order to get our table values. Then we're going to take those table values, and depending on whether we determine we had a left-tailed test or a right-tailed test, from those table values we're going to get p-values. And the way we're going to do that, of course, is going to be exactly the same once we have our test statistic. So when we get to that part of step 4, that's when we're going to use these two tables, one for negative z-scores, one for positive z-scores, included in your cheat sheet. to get table values that will eventually turn into p-values to complete that fourth step. So that's why I included that extra table together with your flowcharts, just to make that as easy as possible. And then, like I said, the next, you can skip this handout here about type 1 and type 2 errors. We're not going to do that. And then this handout, which is the second to last page in the cheat sheet, the only thing of importance on this second to last page is when you get to the fourth step of either flowchart, you're going to eventually get a table value from your table, and you're going to figure out how to get from your table value to a p-value. And that's all this handout, this second to last page of the cheat sheet tells you. It just tells you that if you have a left-tailed test, which we'll determine from step 1, then the table value you get in step 4 will become your p-value. But if you have a right-tailed test, then your p-value is going to be 1 minus the table value you get in table 5. So if your table value were 0.7, let's say, that you got table value 0.7 from the table in step 4, and you were a left-tailed test, then your p-value would be 0.7. P-value, all this says is for left-tailed, p-value equals table value. And all this says is with your right-tailed, your p-value is 1 minus table value. So if your table value is 0.7 and you're a right-tailed test, your p-value is going to be 1 minus 0.7, not 0.7. So your p-value would be 0.3 in that case. So that's the only thing that this is about. If you can just remember that left-tailed test means p-value equals table value, right-tailed test means p-value is 1 minus table value, you really don't even really need this page. This is only if you happen to forget how to treat a left-tailed test versus a right-tailed test when it comes to getting the p-value from the table value in table 5 of step 4. So if you can remember that little fact about left and right-tailed tests and how to get the p-value from the table value in each case, you really don't need this handout from the cheat sheet. And then, like I said, the last page of the cheat sheet is only for the last step, step 6 in either of these flowcharts. And that's just so that you can figure out what your final conclusion is going to be based on your answers from step 1 and step 5. Anyway, that's sort of the overview. So the way I'm going to illustrate this is I'm actually going to, you need to get keep your cheat sheet handy so that we can refer to these flowcharts and handouts as we need them. But the way I'm going to illustrate this is by going through the 4 example problems. I have 2 of each type in those sample problems that are on eCourse. So if you get the handout from eCourse saying sample problems for homework assignment 8 part 1, I'm going to work through those 4 sample example problems. All the solutions are given, but I'm just going to work through and explain them. You can follow along with the handout that shows the step-by-step worked out calculations that lead you to the answer. You don't have to worry about the part, like I said, about the type 1 or type 2 errors, but you need to know how to get through all the way through step 6 and state your final conclusion. I've got 2 problems where you test a claim about a population percentage, and then I've got 2 problems where you test a claim about a population mean. In addition to those worked out problems, you also have a solution key to homework assignment 8 online, which gives more worked out solutions of each type. So you have 2 worked out problems of each type, making 4 worked out problems in this handout for hypothesis test. Then you have at least 2 or 3 more, I think at least 2 more of each type in homework assignment 8. And the solution key to homework assignment 8 also gives you the step-by-step calculations for each of those problems. And then in the solution key to the practice test for test 3, which I also did on video, you have the solutions to problems 9 and 10 on the practice test for test 3, which gives 1 more worked out solution of each type. So you at least have, I think, 4 or 5 worked out examples of each type of hypothesis test available on eCourse in those documents.